coming to tonight's session on how to use data to make better decisions and build great products. Let me give an introduction to our distinguished and admired speaker of tonight, Nikil Ramanathan. Nikil has 7+ years of product and analytics experience across big tech companies such as Amazon, as well as multiple high-growth startups like WeWork and Newsela. He has worked on both internal and external products with an expertise in building and scaling data and reporting products. He has worked across multiple verticals, including video, logistics, real estate, and education. He's also deeply interested in fintech and sports tech spaces. Nikil's expertise also includes customer empathy, product road mapping, data-driven insights, and metrics tracking. Outside of work, he enjoys mentoring and coaching aspiring PMs, writing, and investing. A very warm welcome to you, Nikil. We are absolutely thrilled to have you with us tonight. Handing the session over to you.
Thanks, Shama. I'm going to share my screen now. Can all of you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen, Nikil.
Okay, great. Cool. So, Shama, you gave a great introduction around me. So I think I can probably just summarize this very quickly, but yes, 7 years of product management and product analytics experience. My real focus has been on data and reporting products. So really focused on being a data-driven PM. And this has been across big tech and high growth startups. Today's agenda, we'll go through a quick overview of what data is. Then we'll talk about this concept called the data loop, which is a framework I've invented to think about how to make data-driven decisions. We'll then talk about how to actually apply that framework. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about making decisions in the absence of data. So I do want to get a quick survey just to collect some data around everyone who's out here. So Shama, if you can help me ask that poll.
Sure.
This is actually a nice teaser to the rest of the presentation because a survey is a great way to inform decisions, right? So this is actually going to be a way to help understand who the target audience of this presentation is.
Perfect. I'll launch the first poll now, Nikil.
Okay, thanks.
Audience, I hope you all are able to see the poll on the screen. Please cast your votes and let us know.
Lots from India. It's great. And a few, actually a quarter from other places as well. So that's exciting.
Great. Should I go for the other one?
Yes, please. Oh, great. So a good mix of people. Okay, awesome.
Yeah. Okay, going in for the next one.
Great. And yeah, this presentation will work whether you're an aspiring PM, you're outside of product, or someone who's experienced. But I'll cater that towards this. Awesome. So a lot that are not in product, but then also a number who have been there for 3 or 5+ years. So this is great. Good mix. Cool. So a good mix of somewhat experienced and those who are not at all experienced. So it's great. Hopefully this presentation will help you become more experienced if you are already, and it'll be a good introduction if you aren't yet. So I'm going to jump into the first section, which is an overview of what data is. So data is really a set of quantitative and qualitative values about people and products, right? And data is collected, measured, reported, and analyzed. So why do I give this kind of high level overview? I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of what data is. And when we look at those two pieces, right, qualitative and quantitative, there's a very important distinction here. So quantitative data is going to tell you what customers are doing, and qualitative is going to tell you the why. So when you're looking at things like usage metrics, that's a quantitative metric that's going to tell you, hey, this is what my customer is doing. But if you really want to understand why they're doing that, if that's different than your expectations, that's when you're going to want to look at qualitative data. And we'll get into more of this later on. So some examples, as I mentioned, usage metrics, also A/B tests, NPS, which is Net Promoter Score. On the qualitative side, you have usability studies, user research, as well as individual customer feedback. So what are some of the advantages of data? Like, why do you actually want to be a data-driven product manager? So data gives you a real measurable way into how you are doing. So it's not just telling you the what and the why, but also how you're actually doing in terms of releasing these products. It also allows you to focus on outcome over output. So output is just, hey, I delivered this feature and then I'm on to the next one. Outcome is really about, I delivered this feature, did it meet the mark? Did I hit success? And data allows you to actually measure that. So it really informs, validates, and tracks your product ideas. So overall, this isn't to say that data and analytics are the only tool, but it is a tool in your arsenal as a product manager. And it's a useful one if you're good at it. When used correctly, it really replaces judgments and opinions, and it empowers better decision-making. And ultimately, you're going to build better products, and customers are going to love and use those products. So now we'll get into the data loop. So the data loop is really a series of repeatable steps used within product development, and it's used in order to effectively make use of data. So to make that more tangible, there are really 7 steps to the data loop. And I'll kind of walk through them briefly here, and then we'll go into more detail through the presentation. But it's identifying your North Star metric, setting your objectives and key results, understanding user behavior, creating a hypothesis, then validating that product, collecting data, and then, of course, at the end, measuring success. And why is this something I call a data loop? Well, if you look at the last step of measuring success, that measurement of success is going to loop back to step 3, which is understanding user behavior. When you measure success of a product and you are successful, then you're able to use that and say, here's my new data. Now I'm going to use that data to understand user behavior, and the loop starts over. Another real benefit of the data loop is that it minimizes decisions based on opinions and gut feelings, right? So we really want to move away from judgment and opinions and closer to data-driven decisions. And again, we're really optimizing this on what customers are doing rather than what we think is right. As a PM, you want to focus on the customers, not on what you might think. So really, there's like 3 parts of the product development process where this loop really factors in, and I've kind of broken it out. So at a high level, you're going to want to define your metrics and objectives. Then you're going to go into product discovery and experimentation. And then finally, at the end, you're going to want to quantify that success. So to go a little bit deeper on the defined metrics and objectives spot, we're going to talk about the North Star metric and the objectives and key results. In terms of the product discovery and experimentation, there's really 3 steps here: the user behavior, creating that hypothesis, and then most importantly, probably the most important step of all, validating the product. And then once we've validated that product, we want to build it and collect the data, and then measure and track success. So how do we actually apply all of these, right? We have these high-level 7 steps. How do we actually start applying it? So as I mentioned, we have these 3 different buckets, right? So let's jump into this first one of define metrics and objectives. So within this, you have 2 pieces, the North Star metric and your OKRs, your objectives and key results. So what is a North Star metric? North Star metric is a top-line metric that guides your company's vision and priorities. These can often be very different depending on whether you're at a big tech company, whether you're at a startup, whether you are just founding a company and are very early stage. So oftentimes the size and the scale of your growth are going to impact what you want to focus on. An important distinction here is that the North Star metric is often set by the CEO or the founder. And maybe this is a chief product officer if your company is very, very large. But what you should, as a product manager, you should be readily clear around what that North Star metric is. And whoever that person is that has set it should make sure that everyone in the organization knows it. But in particular, the PMs need to know this in order to create their product vision. And everything you do beyond, from product development to product discovery is based off of what that North Star metric is for your company. So just a few examples here, depending on, again, where you are as a company or where you are in the stage of growth, will kind of factor into what North Star metric you want to use. In terms of customer acquisition, that's really early on in the funnel of really just trying to get users on board. When we talk about engagement and retention, that's once we've gotten to a point where we have some level of activity, and then we're actually trying to create that repeat behavior, that stickiness. If we are, a startup, and we may actually just be focusing on revenue, right? How do we get that first customer so that we can generate positive cash flow? For a few larger companies, things like efficiency or sentiment can be used. Sentiment, a great way to do that is through the Net Promoter Score and understanding how satisfied customers are. And efficiency, it can really be measured in terms of how quickly you're growing, right? So this is something that can be oftentimes measured in terms of like customer acquisition cost or your consumption growth as a percentage of the number of customers you have. So then once you have your North Star metric, as a PM, oftentimes you're the ones who are going to be developing your OKRs. So OKRs, objectives and key results, are really pretty common nowadays in most tech companies. Some tech companies will focus more on KPIs, or they might call it something different, but really OKRs are the staple. And they serve really 2 purposes here. So the objectives are designed to actually motivate people. So as a PM, a big part of your job is to actually motivate the people around you, right? So the objective is closely related to that North Star metric, and it's going to be a motivator. The key results are really focused on measuring progress towards your goals. So the key results here are quantitative, and they should measure, again, outcomes, not output. So really focusing on delivering results, not just delivering features. Again, as an individual PM, you should be setting your OKRs for your team and making sure that they tie back to that North Star metric, which is why it's important to understand what that metric is. It's also really important if you're at a large organization in particular, that as you develop your OKRs and now as other PMs develop their OKRs, that you have a single rubric or scale so that the key results of different PMs and different product teams can easily be compared. This is something that's oftentimes missing in organizations. And if you are a PM and you see this, where, yeah, we're going through the exercise of writing OKRs, but we don't really have a single standardized scale, I would push your chief product officer or push whomever is the person in charge of that product team to really set that scale for you. So now let's jump into kind of the bulk of where the data-driven decision-making comes in, right? It's the product discovery and the experimentation. So high level, what is product discovery, right? It's really about de-risking an idea to a problem, right? And you're really trying to find the right product for the right market. And the key thing to remember here is that this is an iterative process. Oftentimes, I see product managers will take an idea and then they'll jump immediately to start road mapping and developing that idea or designing against that idea. Product discovery is all about taking that step back and saying, okay, is there any risk involved with this idea? And if so, how can I de-risk it by doing some iterative tests? Product discovery really focuses on answering 3 questions. We're really going to be focusing on the first one in terms of the data, which is, will the customer buy and or use this, right? And this is huge, right? From a buy perspective, that's all about generating revenue. And then use is all about the value of your product. If no one's using it, it doesn't really feel like you haven't really accomplished your goal. Again, that's about the outcomes versus the output. So when looking at understanding user behavior, right, this key step is going to involve quantitative and qualitative data. And it's really about understanding from a quantitative side what customers are doing, and then from a qualitative side, why they're doing it. So as I touched on a little bit earlier, qualitative data can come in the form of user research, usability studies, but surveys and customer feedback are ultimately a great way to understand why your customers are doing things. So surveys oftentimes are great ways to understand patterns or trends within a target market. For example, when I asked the poll earlier, right, I'm understanding the patterns of, okay, what does my market actually look like? Are they more experienced product managers? Are they familiar with data? So surveys can be a really useful tool in that way. Customer feedback in general is very useful just to observe how people are using your product. Oftentimes, just by going to someone's environment, you can actually see that people are using a product in ways that you didn't even expect. And I've seen this a lot, particularly even in building out data and reporting tools where you're like, okay, they're going to want to use standardized data and they'll report it in the same exact way. And then you find that they're actually putting in text notes, they're doing other types of things. So that's where customer feedback becomes really useful to kind of disconfirm your initial assumptions. Now, quantitative data can come in the form of a lot of different things. And it kind of usually follows this type of framework, which is your basic usage metrics. How are customers using this? Then you go into the customer insights. You might look at a funnel analysis, and then the deeper analyses are usually on the cohort side. And I won't really talk about the data science pieces or the data science modeling in this presentation, but that's certainly another way when you're really trying to discover whether this and de-risk a product to do that. To go a little bit deeper on each of those components, usage metrics really showcase what your customers are actually doing, whereas the customer insights, such as your Net Promoter Score, are really helping you to understand your user sentiment and satisfaction. Okay, my customers are not really using this, but the ones who do, they are really satisfied. Okay, that's a big insight for me, right? Then I want to dive into why, which is when I would do the qualitative. A funnel analysis is really useful in terms of understanding where customers are converting and or dropping off. So if people are churning at a certain stage, right, typical funnel looks something like the acquisition, the activation, the retention, and then ultimately you're trying to monetize them. So where in that funnel are they dropping off? That's a really key way to understand the root cause. And then the cohort analyses really deep dive on those segments, right? So, okay, people are using our product, but they're not coming back, they're not repeating. Okay, now I can deep dive on those activated customers and start to identify, okay, is it a device issue? Is it a locale issue? And start doing some interesting cohort analyses. One thing I often see is that product managers, have a loose understanding of their data, but they oftentimes are reliant on their data analysts. I don't think that's a good behavior. I think product managers should be looking at these types of metrics daily, and they should really understand them very, very well. Now, you might have a high level understanding of your company-wide metrics, but the metrics that matter to you and your product team that influence those OKRs that you've written, you should be monitoring them daily. They're really the way that you can understand what's happening, understand the trends, and really make product decisions. If you don't have data on your customers, you need to start creating a plan to start capturing that. Maybe that's talking with the data team and helping to build a dashboard or build tracking. And I'll talk a little bit about if you don't have at the end, if you don't have any data, how you can start to make decisions. Okay, so creating hypotheses, right? So this is really the part where you've understood this user behavior, you kind of have evaluated these trends, and then you're like, okay, now I have some new ideas and a hypothesis around like what we should actually do. Now, keep in mind, right? Customers often do what you don't expect them to do, right? So you might have a hypothesis, but what you really want to do is drive your hypotheses from what your customers are doing, not from what you believe, right? You want to try and minimize those assumptions and really just follow the data from your customers. And if you're curious as to why are they doing that? I really don't think that makes sense. That's when the qualitative data comes in. So again, you should really be focusing on the user problems, not your own problems, and not on solutions. Focus on the pain points, and then that's how you develop good solutions. Hypotheses should be easily testable, right? This is not something that should, take years to test, particularly at least for most of your features, right? And again, the customer data should inform the hypothesis, not your own beliefs. So the most important thing of this entire presentation, I would say, is this piece, right? Is the validating of product ideas. So product validation is really about experimentation. And there's two ways you can do this. One is through A/B testing, and the other is through usability studies. A/B testing is going to be more of a quantitative way to do it, and usability studies are going to be more of your qualitative, though you can make usability studies quantitative as well. When I've built data and reporting products in the past, this is doing some level of live data prototypes where the data actually updates in real time. You're understanding performance, you're understanding latency, you're also understanding how do customers actually use that data, and do they export that data? Do they take that data and analyze it in the view? And that can really be done through a usability study. But to talk a little bit more about each of these two, right? So the A/B tests really allow you to experiment by taking two versions, a control and a test, and then seeing what works better in real life settings. And your A/B tests should be set up such that half your users are in your control and half in the variable. Now, the one caveat to that is if you're moving very quickly, right? And in general with experimentation, you should be optimizing more for speed while still capturing data. Like this shouldn't be something that's slowing your business down. It should really be a way to just experiment, right? Or like if you have very few customers, right? And if giving half of your customers means like giving 1 out of 2 customers, you might need to kind of figure out like what is the right percentage to do this, or maybe you just talk to both customers in person, right? You make this more of a qualitative study. So in terms of the best practices for A/B testing, you want to make sure that you have a hypothesis before you run the test, right? And this seems like very simple, but I see a lot of product managers who will jump into an A/B test like, oh, we got to test this. And then it's like, okay, like, was it successful? And then they're like, well, yes, I guess it was, because we saw this, we saw users doing X, Y, Z. But if that's not your goal, if that's not the metric you're actually tracking, then it doesn't matter, right? If customers are more engaged, but you're really tracking, acquisition, like increase of users, then that's not the hypothesis you're trying to validate. So it's really important to have a clear hypothesis or goal before you run the test and understand what you are measuring. On that note, what you want to also make sure you do with this 50-50 split is that you determine a minimum sample size that you need. At large companies, this is much, much easier. At smaller companies, you might need to figure out, okay, what is that minimum sample size that I need to hit for our test bucket so that I have statistically significant results. And on that note of statistically significant, what you really usually want to do is run these tests for at least one business cycle. Oftentimes, the business cycle is a week. That might be a little bit different depending on your company, but you want to make sure that it goes through that entire business cycle. Other things you want to be looking out for with regard to your A/B tests are confounding variables. So even if you see an increase, you want to make sure, okay, was there another A/B test being run by another team? Was there anything else that could have impacted it from like a seasonal impact? Oh, this is like a holiday, so that's why we saw more users, things like that. You want to be sure that you're trying to minimize as many confounding variables as possible so that you're really getting meaningful results. Usability studies. As I mentioned, it's really about understanding the why people are doing something. The most important thing you can know for usability studies is that you should really be observing, don't assume anything and don't evaluate your users. You just want to observe them. So the best way is really by asking a lot of open-ended questions and then just observing what they do with those questions. If they ask you a question back, like, oh, I think this should do this, like, does it do this? Then you want to basically ask them that question back. It's like, I don't know, do you think it should do this? So you really want to use these as an opportunity to observe. You don't want to answer questions for them or assume any of your knowledge in there. An important thing to note is that you should iterate quickly on these. So if you're testing a hypothesis and you're using prototypes, maybe you have a low fidelity prototype and you're able to somewhat validate a few of your hypotheses in your first couple of usability studies, iterate on that, get to a medium fidelity or a higher fidelity, and then talk to new customers, right? I don't feel like you need to go through an entire set of customers with the same prototypes, with the same questions. You can iterate very quickly through this, and that'll also speed up your product discovery lifecycle. Some great principles for understanding product validation. So I really like the framework that Jeff Bezos uses, and this is also kind of referenced by Daniel Kahneman in terms of behavioral economics as well. But it's really about like type 1 versus type 2 decisions. Type 1 are really focused on kind of system 1 decisions, right? They come fast, intuitive, and in the context of business, they are reversible. And type 2 decisions are irreversible. When it's a type 1 decision, you should feel free to move quickly here, right? There are some decisions where when you have enough data to kind of move forward, and it's okay for the business, right? If you're in a place where it's irreversible, this decision can impact the business. And when evaluating irreversibility, you should really be thinking about brand and reputation, and then revenue or cost. If it's irreversible against those factors, then you really want to slow down a bit, experiment, talk to some more users, maybe get some buy-in from leadership. Specifically, like a good example here, right, is Amazon has its brand or reputation for being very customer obsessed. If you're building a feature that is going to impact the customer experience, right, maybe to benefit sellers, that's something you should slow down and experiment, because that could be irreversible to impacting Amazon's brand. Similarly, if you're at a small company and you're making a decision that could be very costly from like actual money down, but then also in terms of time, also in terms of the net revenue that you could get, then ultimately, if it impacts that bottom line, you should slow down and experiment. But a lot of times, some of these features we can really move quickly on, and we shouldn't be afraid to make those decisions and move quickly. Quantifying success. So this is really about building and collecting data and then measuring and tracking success. So once your product hypothesis is actually validated, you can start to build, right? And once you ship that product, you're going to want to collect data. I can't state this enough. It's critical to include analytics tracking in your product requirements and deliverables. And this should be a non-negotiable. One of the things I often see is that in order to move quickly, product managers will say, okay, we can delay the tracking until V3, or we don't need tracking right now, we'll figure it out later. And sometimes engineers will push back on this as well. Really, this should be a non-negotiable. And the reason why is because, again, you're focused on results, not output. So if you launch this feature and you don't have analytics tracking, how are you going to determine if the product is working? The only way you can actually measure how it's performing is by collecting that data and doing that at scale, right? Sure, you can talk to 1 or 2 customers, but really being able to understand that at scale, you need that data analytics tracking. It also becomes very useful in the context of that full loop, the data loop framework, right? As you monitor this data over time, it's going to feed back into the data loop. So you're going to have this data that you collect, and then you're going to be able to say, oh, this tells me, customers are doing this. Okay, that's a user behavior, and now I have a new hypothesis for my next feature. In terms of measuring and tracking success, once you've collected that data, you should really be measuring your success against your OKRs and your original hypothesis, right? And it's really that 3-step process, right? So you have that North Star metric, which is the metric your company cares about that leads your vision. You then have the OKRs, which are at the product level. And then your success is hopefully moving the needle on that key result. And if that's true, then that is tied to the North Star metric, which ultimately helps your company, which ultimately helps the overall impact of what you're doing. In general, it would be great to already have benchmark metrics before you're tracking success. So the first time you go through this process, you may not have data, right? But once you've gone through it a few times, you now have collected data, and you likely have a benchmark metric. So if you're measuring engagement and you think that your new feature is going to increase engagement by 5%, ideally you should already know what engagement is at today. And then you can say, okay, if it's at 60% today and I launched this feature and now it's 62, okay, I didn't meet my goal, but then also I have an understanding of where I am today. And that's really important. So ultimately you're trying to answer the question, is the feature that you've released moving the needle? If yes, you're good, right? You have now a new benchmark. So in that case, if it was 60 to 65, great. Now 65% is your benchmark for engagement, and that serves back into your user behavior part of the loop. And then if that is working well, NPS becomes even more important to measure kind of those more like satisfaction sentiment type feelings. But again, this question of moving the needle is not like if, but it's like, how do you restart the data loop, right? Because you're going to, if it's successful, you have a new benchmark, and that's what sets the user behavior. But if not, then you need to further iterate on that original hypothesis. So now your findings are the new data, which says, okay, I didn't meet engagement. Now I need to iterate on that and create a new hypothesis. And again, focusing, I can't say it enough, right? Focusing on outcomes, not on output. And ultimately, if you find that the data is not meeting what you thought for measuring success, now you can go determine why. And that's done by talking to customers, doing another usability study. So recapping the key takeaways, really 7 steps in the data loop, right? The North Star metric, which ties to your product's OKRs. You then understand user behavior. You'll create a hypothesis. You validate that hypothesis through an A/B test, a usability study, or some level of data. Once you've collected that data after the product is built, you can then measure success. Ultimately, there's really 5 things that data can really do here, right? It helps you define your goals, inspire new product ideas, and this part's the really exciting part, right? Sometimes the data will show you something you didn't expect at all, and that kind of creates a new way to think about an idea. Testing the ideas, informing product decisions, and then measuring product success. So quickly, I'd like to just chat about what to do in the absence of data. So there are cases, where you may not have any data upfront. So a couple of examples, right? You're building something brand new. So you're in stealth, you don't really want to talk to customers, or you may only want to talk to a select set of customers. Or you just are early in the process and you just haven't collected or measured that data yet, right? You haven't gone through the data loop yet. So what do you do in these cases, right? First off, you want to, if you don't have data at scale, then your best bet is talking to customers, right? And if you don't have access to customers, that's a real problem. But if, let's say you're in this stealth mode where you don't really want to share this idea, or it's a brand new feature for your company, invite-only tests work really, really well in this case. So basically, you can find a few customers, you might even have them sign an NDA, or you basically tell them that this is something that is brand new, that are in your target market, and then you test the features with them. That's like a really, really useful way to gather some level of data. Maybe it's more qualitative, but you're getting some level of data in order to understand whether your hypothesis is actually validated. You just ultimately want to evaluate your risks and what the consequences of failure are. The type 1, type 2 framework makes a lot of sense here, but like, what are the risks here, right? For doing this. If I have this brand new product that's going to go ideally, to hundreds, maybe thousands of customers, that could be a large risk, right? If it doesn't succeed. So in that case, you may want to figure out a way to do these invite-only tests. If it's something that, it's a brand new feature, but it's something that's low risk, then maybe moving fast is the right thing here. And then again, you really oftentimes want to follow the customer, not your own assumptions. So in the absence of data, when you don't have customer insight, one of the best ways to disconfirm your assumptions and beliefs are by evangelizing your ideas with other people on the product team, your engineers, your designers, your data team, and other stakeholders like leadership, right? Because as you start to share your ideas, they will start to have their own thoughts on that. Oh, I actually don't think this is true. Like, we really need to test this assumption. Or, oh, like, yes, I think all of us kind of believe that this is the metric we're moving towards, and this is the feature we should be working on. So you can actually start to disconfirm those beliefs even within your team, and that will get you a more well-rounded hypothesis. So ultimately, if you have no data, right, you're going to have to use judgment and instincts. You don't want to slow down the company if the risk is low, as I mentioned. Like, this is a place where good judgment moves really, really well. If the risk is high, disconfirm your beliefs, talk with the key stakeholders, and figure out where the risk is, and make sure you involve those stakeholders, right? If it's a risk against revenue, talk to the finance team. If you have something that might impact, the brand of your company, bring in marketing. If this could potentially impact the viability of your business, at an early stage startup, get the CPO, get the CEO, get the co-founders in the room, and really talk this through before you move forward. Remember, like, if you can get data, you should use it. But using good judgment, so using good judgment is really not an excuse for not using data, but in the absence of data, that's really what the best way is to make decisions. Great, and then that's the end. I'd love to open it up for some questions.
Thank you for delivering a brilliant session, Nikil. Really great and thought-provoking insights. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was in mute all this while. Right. So thank you for delivering a brilliant session, Nikil. Really great and thought-provoking insights. And as you can see, we already have a few questions lined up for you in the Q&A window. Give me a moment to share my screen. You can have a look at the questions meanwhile. Audience, please go ahead and ask your questions in the Zoom Q&A window or in the comment section for LinkedIn viewers. And if you're interested in coming online and asking your questions live to Nikil, please raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your questions directly to Nikil. So let's go with the first question here, Nikil. So this is from Sri Mundan. Can you say how data science is used in early stage startups? Can you compare value of data as used by established companies like Facebook, Amazon, etc., and as useful for the early stage startup?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think in general, I'll talk a little bit about data science, but I'll focus more around the data analytics because that's really the piece that I'm more familiar with. But in terms of like these larger, more established companies, they're going to be doing much more of what is true data science. So Facebook, Amazon, when you talk to data scientists there, they're really taking a lot of these trends, the data from potentially these cohort analyses, and then they start modeling against that, right? And what they're really trying to test is, okay, there might be a correlation between a few of these variables that we're seeing, but what is the actual is there an actual causation here? And if not, like what is the power of that correlation? Is it a strong correlation? Is that something that we can use to really drive our metrics? An example at Amazon is when I was working on the Prime Video team, we had the X-ray feature, which shows actor, character, trivia information in playback. And what we really wanted to understand was, is this correlated with, is being someone who uses X-ray often correlated with being a Prime customer? And then ultimately, when we found, yes, that is correlated, we wanted to start looking, we asked data science teams to start looking at, like, is there actually some level of causation here? Like if we actually put more videos with X-ray, can we actually increase ultimately our Prime Video customers? And Prime is like a much larger business, right? So if you think of it in the data loop, it's like increasing Prime Video customers is more of like the North Star metric for the video team. And then increasing X-ray usage is really just like an OKR within our team. So I would say like the more established companies, they really do true data science and they really start to get into that level. That's true at some early stage startups if they're super data centric, Databricks, Snowflake, they're doing that as well. But oftentimes in an early stage startup, you really don't have a lot of data, right? But the flip side to that is you have much less risk, right? The brand reputation is much less on the line. And if it's relatively low cost, just move quickly and use the data that you have to make decisions. So I would say that the larger companies, they have the luxury of using more of data science and analytics because of their size, but they also have larger risk, right? They have much more reputation on the line. The early stage startup, you can usually experiment fairly quickly and then make decisions that way.
Perfect. So let's go ahead with the next question here. This is from Chaitali. While doing multivariate A or B testing, are there any best practices to follow?
Yeah, so in terms of like best practices for A/B testing, you want to basically determine a minimum sample size, right? So that's like really, really important. In terms of like doing multivariate, there's potentially going to be a few different factors that you're looking at. I personally would encourage like A/B testing to be done strictly on a single variable so that you can reduce any types of confounding variables, and you can focus on specifically what metric, like what is the one metric you're trying to move. So I would really try and minimize the confounding variables, increase your sample size, and then ensure that you've done this test over a significant amount of time so that you can actually validate your metric. But yeah, I would much more encourage like focusing on a single metric and doing testing against that. I think multivariate could be useful from more of like a data science perspective, but yeah, I would really encourage you to focus on one specific metric.
Okay, we'll raise this next question. From Srimukundan again, this is an interesting one. Can you compare the skill set differences between data scientist and data science product manager who normally design the experiments, sample size, duration of experiment, control variant, etc.?
Yeah, so I think there's usually like a few different factors in terms of roles. So there at different companies, there's going to be like a data scientist role, then there's going to be like a business intelligence analyst, a business analyst, right? And then there's going to be product managers that could be, data product managers of growth, product managers like on the data science team. So it can vary quite a bit depending on what company you're at in terms of those specific roles. But I would say in terms of like the biggest difference between a product I'll talk much more about differences between a product manager and like a data scientist, because the data science product manager, yes, all of the skills that you have in terms of being a data scientist, in terms of being naturally quantitative, in terms of being analytical, in terms of being able to take a lot of data and distill it into clear insights, like all of those things are still valuable. But when you are a product manager, the key part is really about like how you evangelize that information, right? So a data scientist is going to be much more focused on producing that value and providing it to the product manager. The product manager is much more focused on taking that, evangelizing it with others, and then using that to say, how does this impact like what I'm actually building? In terms of your second question around like who normally designs the experiment. So that's usually a partnership between your analyst or data scientist and the product manager. The product manager is often going to be asked about the business cases, right? So it's like, we want to run this experiment. It's like, why do we want to run this experiment, right? Like, what is the customer value here? What are we actually trying to test? Those are all things that the product manager should be in charge of. So anything that's related to business viability, value, anything related to like what the customer is doing. The data scientist is going to oftentimes do the actual like implementation of these things, but the factors that you're talking about in terms of sample size, duration of experiment, the product manager should definitely encourage a data scientist or a data analyst to abide by those, but a good data analyst or data scientist should already know how to best run an A/B test. The product manager's job is really to take those results, kind of clarify those insights, and then use that to then influence product direction.
This was great. Thank you, Nikil. And in view of the time constraints, we will have to end the Q&A here, audience. Thank you so much for your participation.